The Industrial Revolution was a succession of major changes in the British economy which unfolded between the 17th and 19th centuries. The principal cause was the switch from an organic to an inorganic economy. The increasing adoption of inorganic energy meant numerous major changes in the economy took place. According with the popular conception of the Industrial Revolution, there were technological developments such as Cartwright's power loom and, importantly, Cork's method of iron smelting. However, technology should not overshadow other changes, as in some respects, technology merely enhanced growth that was already occurring. Firstly, a geographical concentration of industry took place, which developed distinct regional economies, such as cotton textile production in Manchester. Secondly, changes in transportation methods are what made the Industrial Revolution viable, as products could now be exported a long distance while still making a profit. Thirdly, agricultural changes increased food production, enabling population growth and urbanization. Finally, overseas trade provided the raw materials necessary to feed Britain's growing industries.
The replacement of organic with inorganic material to release energy was a fundamental aspect of the Industrial Revolution. Coal was the most important inorganic energy source, which displaced wood as the most used energy source by 1650. In 1700, around 50% of England's energy was provided by coal. By 1850, coal now provided 90% of England's energy. 1 ton of coal could release as much energy as an acre of woodland. Widespread intensive industries would have been almost impossible without coal, as by 1850, to obtain an equivalent amount of energy from wood, the felling of 48 million acres of woodland would be required, an area larger than Wales and England combined. Beforehand, for thousands of years, ancient, medieval, and early modern economies were predominantly powered and reliant upon power from animals, humans, water, and wind. Therefore, the complete change in the primary sources of energy in a relatively short period of time was truly revolutionary in the context of human history. Coal destroyed the age-old constraints which inhibited growth in the past. Coal contributed towards technological progress as people developed ways of extracting more coal and applied coal to manufacturing to harness its energy. Notably, the atmospheric steam engine was originally invented by Thomas Newcomen to drain water from coal mines, with its first use in 1712. The invention largely happened because the coal mining industry provided demand for a greater supply of more powerful steam engines. It took James Watt's redesign to make a rotative engine in 1782 to widen its use. By 1800, there were 500 engines designed by James Watt in factories. These factories pre-existed the installation of steam engines. Therefore, the gradual implementation of steam engines met the demand of already growing industries, facilitating their expansion, but not necessarily instigating the initial spark of growth themselves. The demand came from coal's low cost compared to wood, and other fuels making steam machines cost-effective. One technological development which did instigate change was Henry Cork's puddling process, which was a method of using coke without charcoal to make bar iron, which Cork developed in 1784. Removing charcoal from iron production helped the emergence of regionalized industries. Forges no longer required nearby wood sources. Therefore, great integrated establishments quickly formed where industrial processes were concentrated together. New types of communities with dense populations formed around concentrated industries. Examples include Clydeside around Glasgow in Scotland and in South Wales. This enabled increased iron output. In 1828, iron production was 1,029% higher than in 1788, just after Cork's invention. Regions became specialized around various industries. The Midlands focused on small metalwares, Manchester on cotton textile manufacturing, and Glasgow on steamships. The switch to an inorganic economy is another factor in the regionalisation, as Durham and Northumberland accounted for over half the growth in coal production. The concentration of entire sectors did not occur to this extent before the Industrial Revolution. A radical restructuring of Britain's transport systems took place. The first purpose-built canal, built during the 1760s, was the Bridgewater Canal, which linked Manchester with mines in Worsley. Canal construction was slow, as approximately 2,000 miles of canal took 60 years to build. However, the fact that 52 parliamentary acts concerning canals passed in just 15 years after 1760 indicates that the drive to build canals happened suddenly. Moreover, this occurred with roads after 1760 as well, with 422 turnpike acts passed during 14 years. This demonstrates the revolutionary nature of the changes, as government authorities became far more interventionist in their attitudes towards developing transport infrastructure. The intensifying of regional identities and trade within and between regions was aided by the enhanced transport systems. Regions became internally integrated and differentiated from each other as they developed upon their comparative advantages. Furthermore, transport made cooperation between regions more direct by often removing the need to rely on London as a medium during trade. For example, cloth exports from the West Riding of Yorkshire to Liverpool increasingly came under the jurisdiction of Yorkshire merchants. The extra regional transport links increased trade specialisation, as regions concentrated on production of just the several export goods to supply the demands of other regions. The punctiform nature of coal production motivated transport development to transport coal from the regions where it was mined to where it was needed as fuel. Coal was 95% cheaper to transport on waterways than on roads. This meant canals were increasingly used for the transportation of raw materials. Adam Smith noted the resultant increased demand for transport enabled increased distances between the producer and the consumer. This was essential in allowing regions to export to each other and develop their respective regional economies. Britain underwent the so-called First Industrial Revolution. The corresponding assertion is that Britain was ahead of other countries in development, which to a large extent was correct. This came across clearly when William Waterson wrote in his Encyclopedia of Commerce, published in 1847, that Britain's roads were unequalled and that Britain's transportation system brought the admiration of the world. Belgium was Britain's closest competitor in industry, but was still dwarfed by Britain's huge coal output, which was over 5 times greater. Britain's high coal production resulted from geographical advantages, notably Britain's underground mountain of coal. Furthermore, Britain had natural transport infrastructure, as being an island allowed for inexpensive coastal shipping. For example, coal shipments from Newcastle to London fueled London's industry, passing down England's east coast. This made Britain's transition from an organic to inorganic economy straightforward. Britain's relatively high-wage economy and cheap energy from coal incentivized mechanization as a means to drive down labor costs. Additionally, Britain's extensive role in colonies and overseas trade in its empire, particularly the trade of cotton, aided the Industrial Revolution. The cotton textile industry is an essential case study exemplifying the importance of overseas trade. By the mid-1800s, it was cheaper to import Indian cotton all the way to Britain, manufacture textiles from it in Britain, and then export it back to India, than to produce products next to where the cotton was grown in India, despite travelling around 24,000 miles. India was a low-wage economy, with wages 4 times lower than Britain, which made cotton farming cheap in India, in addition to India's climatic suitability for growing cotton. This shows that while high wages spurred technological progress domestically, Britain still also required low-wage economies to exploit in the labour-intensive processes of providing raw materials. This was supplied by Britain's imperial foreign policy of maintaining colonies. In 1836, cotton wool, weighing 7,600 pounds, was imported from India. Cotton was also imported from the United States, taking advantage of cheap slave labour. Access to low-wage economies was needed to sustain rapid growth in Britain's cotton industry, especially around Manchester. The fact that nearly all the raw materials used to produce cotton textile products were imported to Britain underlined the importance of Britain's overseas trade during the Industrial Revolution. The cotton textile industry also demonstrates the role of machinery and how bottlenecks could be reached at various stages of innovation, preventing the further increase of production. James Watt's steam machinery, introduced after 1785, was very effective in processing raw cotton into yarn. However, it caused yarn overproduction that outstripped the labour supply needed to use so much yarn. Therefore, it did little to improve the production of finished cotton products overall. Between 1820 and 1838, yarn and twist export increased 398%, whereas the export of finished cotton products only increased by 178%. The installation of Cartwright's power loom eventually allowed for finished product production of cotton products to catch up with yarn production in the 1800s. Even by 1838, production of textiles was still bottlenecked by a shortage of labour and a shortage of power looms. To unlock a greater supply of labour, radical changes were required in the agricultural sector. Rapid improvements in agriculture sustained large population growth during the 18th and 19th centuries. Between 1701 and 1870, the population of England and Wales grew by around 15 million. In 1798, economist Thomas Malthus made his famous prediction that geometrical population growth would overwhelm the arithmetical growth of food supply, making population growth unsustainable. The figures Malthus used were based on models of previous agricultural yields. Malthus's prediction did not come true due to revolutionary changes in agriculture which prevented this disaster unfolding. One change was the ever-increasing rate of enclosure, whereby strip farms and pasture, held in common by multiple rural farmers, were consolidated together into larger, individually owned fields, distinctively separated from each other by hedges and fences. The passing of enclosure acts by Parliament became commonplace after 1750. In the decade before 1750, only 10 enclosure acts were passed. This increased to 480 enclosure acts in the decade before 1770. Enclosure contributed to improved agricultural productivity, which was 138% higher in 1850 than in 1700. The change to a more inorganic economy also reduced wasteland, as it meant less firewood was used. Therefore, more land could undergo deforestation to make way for agriculture, as there was less of a need to grow firewood. Technological developments from industry, such as threshing machines and iron ploughs, were introduced during the Napoleonic Wars. Later developments, after 1830, associated with the high farming period, included guano imports, drains, and modern building materials. The addition of railway transport in the 19th century facilitated communication and the movement of rural labourers throughout the countryside, further improving agricultural production. Consequently, the better diets available likely made industrial workers more productive. Population growth, sustained by improved agriculture, increased the size of the workforce, providing labour for the growing industries, and demonstrated the growing distinctiveness of regional economies. The use of the increased population as an industrial workforce is evident in that urban centres saw a relatively larger rise in population in an uneven fashion. London's population growth only managed to keep up with national population growth throughout the 18th century. In comparison, regional towns outside of London doubled their proportion of the urban population to 60% during the 18th century. Manchester's population increased from 10,000 in 1700 to 89,000 by 1800. This correlated with the expansion of Manchester's cotton industry, which incentivized people to move into Manchester to carry out labour-intensive work, emphasizing the necessity of an increasing population to industry. Intense urbanization occurred in South Wales, with the appearance of new towns, which correlated with the growth of the iron industries there. Scotland also experienced urbanization. Glasgow's population increased by 3% a year during the 1830s. Coal was the underlying factor behind urbanization, as without it, there would have been fewer factories to attract people to move to the towns to work. Most regional towns, which experienced fast rates of urbanization, were situated somewhat near coalfields. This is shown by the migration of people to a strip of urbanizing towns, going west from Lancashire to South Yorkshire and the West Midlands, which were all near coal fields. For example, Birmingham's population increased from 8,000 in 1700 to 74,000 in 1801. The coal fields provided coal that supplied energy to factories, which in turn required a large workforce. Britain's relatively high industrial wages attracted rural people to move into towns to fill these jobs, therefore driving urbanization. To conclude, the Industrial Revolution in Britain was predominantly driven by the uptake of inorganic energy. If wood continued to be the main source of energy instead, industrial growth would have been stifled, as land constraints would limit energy production. The population growth made possible by increased agricultural productivity was necessary to supply growing centres of industry, such as Manchester, with a workforce. Removing the dependence on wood's organic energy assisted in this, as it made more land available for food production. The urban centres, which saw the biggest population rises, were near coalfields, which demonstrated the influence of inorganic energy on a regional level. The proliferation of industrial regions, with specialised production and improved transport, significantly shifted economic power away from London and the south, towards distinct regions, which were often in the north. Technology did enhance production, but it often met the demand of already growing industries, therefore was not the sole cause of the Industrial Revolution in itself. Although Cork's technological development in iron production had a wide impact, it was only possible due to the shift to inorganic material, as coke was derived from coal. Britain's unique characteristics made these changes possible. For example, coal's abundance underground provided the cheapest energy in the world, while the low-wage colonies of Britain's empire supplied cheap raw materials such as cotton for Britain's cotton textile industry. Moreover, Britain's cheap energy combined with its relatively high wages motivated technological progress due to the desire to reduce labour costs. The production of this energy, which underpinned technological development, relied upon the burning of coal to release it. Notably, the first atmospheric steam engine in 1712 to pump water out of a coal mine relied on coal as its fuel source. Therefore, the move away from organic energy, namely wood, to inorganic energy, mostly from coal, is central to defining the causes and changes of the Industrial Revolution.